So now we are moving on to the next session, and the next session is going to be handled by Dr. Mohammed Najib Saad, Senior Lecturer, Faculty of Business and Management, University Technology, Mara, Malaysia. He has completed his PhD in International Entrepreneurship. He has also published books and journals. His awards and recognitions include Anugerah Perkhidmatan Cementland University Technology, Mara. We are very happy to have you among us, sir. Handing over the session to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Jaflet. So for today's session, let me share my presentation slide first. For my session, I would like to talk, or I would like to discuss how to identify research gap in research. One of the important part or one of the important elements in writing thesis as well as in writing research articles. So my name is Muhammad Najib Mawasaan from University Technology Mara, Malaysia. And my presentation will cover a few topics. Start with discussing what is research gap, followed by a type of research, and what are the common complaints from examiner and supervisor, as well as I'm going to discuss what are the problems in identifying research gap, why research gap is very important, and the last one I would like to discuss how to identify research gap. So research is very important. What can we define as research is that research is an organized, objective, and systematic process to study a particular problem that needs a solution. So over here, particular research, specific research, start with problems. We live in a very complicated, very complicated, very kind. There are various kind of problems that we are having, and one of the way to solve problem is to do a research. And particular thing we need to identify in doing research is that we need to find a research problem. And for us to identify research problem, the most important thing that we need to identify first is identifying research gap. So what is research gap? I'm referring literature gap in research or in writing articles. So research gap for me is something that I refer to an unexplored topic, something that we explored during our during something that we reveal, something that we discover during our literature review search that have scope for research or further explanation. So over here, by doing or by undergo this literature review, we will discover new thing. We will discover unexplored topic, and this particular unexplored topic is going to be a potential research or further exploration of particular phenomena that have been happen out there. And this particular phenomena that we're going to study is something that will relate to problem, and that particular problem need to be solved by doing a research. So the importance or the essence of research is that we're going to identify also what are the practical problem that very important for us to address in research. And this kind of problem, we can look at in terms of missing or in terms of what is not addressed in the previous research. And with this missing information, it cannot be used, and it can be something that we call limit the ability to reach a conclusion of a particular research. And also we can look at a question in our specialized area that not be answered yet. And with all those, we call that unexplored, missing, or unaddressed of particular problem or particular issue, this establish a need, urgency, and necessity for us for a proposed research project. And again, I would like to emphasize all type of research will always begin with a research gap. And research gap will help us in identify a direction for potential new as well as we call it exciting research. So there are a few type of research gap that we should address. Number one, literature gap. Refer to existing gap in terms of concept or in terms of idea that hasn't been studied at all, or there is a dearth of study with regards to concept or new idea, and there is a room for us to study this neglected area. So the second one would be a conceptual gap, which we refer to researcher found that there is a difference between theory and practice. So when there is a differences between theory and practice, we could investigate this phenomena to find out what are the real facts to this. We call this differences between this theory and practices, and this we refer to conceptual gap. So another gap would be refer to a time gap. So time gap is something that we refer to existing research are outdated, meaning that research to that particular area to a specific area is outdated, has been conducted for a long time ago, and need to be explored again to be explored again in order for us to be further getting what are the previous finding or previous, we call that exploration of means for this particular outdated research. And we need to update with this research in order to further, we call that further explain or further fulfill the body of knowledge with regard to particular area. So next will be the population group gap. So what I mean by population group gap over here is that prior study or previous study or prior research did not focus on specific population. So for example, most of the study had been done in developed country. Not much study had been done in we call that developing country. And also we can zoom into specific, we call that specific group of people. For example, not much been studied on youth, or not much been studied on certain community, or not much been studied on certain organization. This will be something that we refer to population group gap. And the last one is in terms of methodological gap, method that we're going to investigate a certain phenomena. For example, if a particular new phenomena, there is limited information available, limited data available to that particular phenomena. So we need to use, or we need to apply a specific technique that is generating information, which we usually use a qualitative method to further or to explore new things, especially to uncover, we call that certain information or certain finding with regards to that particular phenomena. And these are some of the common complaints by examiner and by supervisor as well as by reviewer with regard to this research gap. So some of the common complaint, some of the common, we call that remarks from the supervisor as well as the examiner. The research gap is very broad, unfocused topic. So over here, one of the way how to narrow down our research gap is we need to identify or we need to discuss the broad area of our study, and then we need to slowly focus to the to the to the topic area, or we need slowly to focus the niche area and the broad discussion to the niche area toward the niche area, then we can identify the research gap for particular topic. And number two, examiners always complain that we they do not they do not they do not really identify, or they do not really recognize, or they not really find out what are the issue. And with this regard, what happened is that researcher is failed to highlight, we call that the major issue, especially in terms of research gap. So another complains that there is no real research question, position, a clump of information as a rough idea, roughly sorted idea into category. Another complaint or another there is an appropriate source of data to problem statement or research idea. Another thing is that there is disorganized of this research gap in our writing, especially there is no coherence between a topic to another topic that will result to disorganized of writing thesis or in writing of our research paper. And these are the problem, these are the common problem in identifying research gap. So normally, research simply start with a research aim, and then what happened is that many of the researchers claim that research aim is already the research gap. But in real practice, research gap is not the same with research aim. And what happened right now is that most of researchers, they just copied or they just pattern their study on previous research. And with this, we call that pattern copied of previous research. So there is no novel contribution toward the body of knowledge, and there is no novel contribution of their study, which resulted that poor quality of thesis and poor quality of research paper. And what most important thing is that we need to have a novel contribution by identifying research gap. And research gap is not, we call that research aim. And with this, we need to differentiate what is research gap and what is research aim. This is a typical example how we can differentiate what is research aim and what is research gap. One typical example, one research title. For example, over here, imposed career study among university students in Malaysia. And the research aim is that the proposed research aim is to determine the life experience of those students who were just forced to take a certain career course according to the wishes of their parents or significant others, and how it affects the psychological emotional and social well-being of the student. So this is the research aim whereby we're going to determine the life experience of those students who just forced to take courses according the wish to their parent, and we're going to find out how it affect their psycho-emotional and social well-being to the student. And this we call that research aim is quietly different from research gap. And if you can write or we can identify research can the issue clearly in our writing, so that will be the way how we can visualize or how we can write our research gap. So the same topic over here in post-career study among university students in Malaysia. So how we're going to identify research gap is that, number one, the researcher may learn from their experience or through literature review that there are university students in Malaysia, for example, who were just forced to take certain career course according to the wish of their parent or significant others, and these students were devastated and becoming rebellious in their school, meaning that this phenomena or this issue have been identified by the researcher by the mean of we call that their own experience through observation or through case study or through interview or through the literature review. And with this, we call that phenomena forcing students to take certain course for future career. And for this reason, the student may become social delinquent in the future. And we need to argue, we need to critique, we need to comment, and we need to come up with our point of view. For example, therefore, based on the research initial review of related literature, so it was found out that no study has been conducted on this topic. So over here, we emphasize that there is no study has been conducted in this topic. So this is something that we refer to research gap, which is what is missing or what has not been addressed yet. And why we need to study this topic, or why we need to address this problem, is because researcher we argue that there is a need to determine the life experiences of these students so that we can create a career decision making program, as well as we call that an alternative in addressing this research problem. So there is a differences between research aim and research gap, whereby in research gap, we will review the literature, we will argue, we will critique, and lastly, we will come up with our point of view by arguing that that particular problem or particular issue or particular topic has not been studied, conducted in that particular area, and that missing information or missing we call that data or something that been not addressed is something that we refer to research gap. So far, any question, please? So far, any question, please, from the floor? Any question, please?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Next step is what are the problem in identifying research gap? So some of the problem that I found that been faced by the researcher or the student or the PhD student out there is that effort in dealing with an enormous amount of information, overwhelmed with so many information, make the researcher, especially the student, not easy to identify the research gap. That's number one, in terms of a lot of information that we're going to analyze in order to identify the research gap. That's number one, enormous amount of information or a lot amount of information. Number two, difficulty of searching in an organized manner. So with this, we call that with this lots of information, enormous amount of information, it is hard for us to search this particular information to identify gap in an organized manner. And another important, we call it important thing that we need to address in identifying research gap is that most of the researcher or the student out there, they hesitate in questioning established norm. So over here, they reluctant to critique, to comment the established, we call that finding, or the established, we call that information that been gathered or that been identified earlier. And this will result a problem in identifying research gap, whereby if they be able to critique, comment of the established finding or the past finding, so it's one of the way how we can identify research gap for our specific study. And there is a no shortcut in identifying research gap. And in order for us to identify a gap of study or research gap, you need or we need to thorough review of the existing literature in both broad and specific area of study. So we need to study a particular area in broad as well as we narrow down to our specific area of study. And from this broad to specific area of study, by focusing on our niche areas, we will be able to identify what are the research gap, what are recent research gap that we should explore with regards to our area of study. Why it is important for us to identify research gap? Number one, for PhD student, for a master student, research gap is very important because research gap will create, we call that novelty of study, will create new thing will discover new area of our study. And if we fails to identify research gap, we need to undergo a major revision. We need to redo or we need to reconstruct again the thesis. And the most afraid or the most something that very critical is that we need to do a major revision as well as we need to revival. So this is something is very important prior writing of our thesis or prior writing of our paper. So we need to identify research gap to prevent from a major revision of our thesis or articles. Number two, with a good research gap, with we call that attractive research gap, it will help us in publishing our research, in terms of publishables. And also with a good research gap, it will create a uniqueness and original research that will contribute to the body of knowledge. And also with a comprehensive, holistic, robust research gap, it will symbolize the deep knowledge of our research on particular topic with regards to our field of study. So this is how we're going to identify research gap. So these are some of the tips, some of the way how we can identify research in gap. Number one, you should start with something that you are passionate about, something that you interested more about, and with this will motivate you to further identify new thing or to further identify what are the things that not been studied yet. Say for example, my area, especially industry, is more on finance, but my passion is to develop an entrepreneur, and I'm more passionate on how to develop or how to come up with we call that certain module or certain model to double entrepreneur. And from that, my interest is more on, we call it exploring the entrepreneurship world. And this particular, we call that exploration, especially in terms of finding research gap, finding the issue or problem with regard to this, we call the entrepreneurship area, is something that been driven by my passion toward developing, we call that entrepreneur in a country as well as what we call in the world. That's one. Number one, you start with something that you are passionate about. Number two, identified issue that not been addressed by the literature. Try to look at what are the issue, what are the problem that not been discussed by the literature. And this, we call that, this issue can be identified or can be addressed by looking at what are the mega trend or what are the recent debate in the area of your study. And with this, we call that a COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the area of interest in the field of entrepreneurship is we relates to the automation and digitalization, which is a very crucial for the survival of company. So another way how to identify research is by looking at a certain section. For example, looking at a suggestion for future research, or looking at conclusion of study, or looking at a limitation section. And these three sections will help us to identify what are the future things, what are the limited, or what are the, we call that untapped area that we should focus in order for us to generate or to identify, we call that research gap. So another way of to identify research gap is by looking at citation or references, the most important study in your field, to see what has been done on that particular area. So another way how to identify research gap is that by looking at what are the key terms associated with that particular issue or problem. So search for key term for that particular issue or problem, and this will direct it to identifying a particular research gap on that particular field of research. So another means how to identify research gap is through thoroughly review recent literature, which is cited by the key publication, the most, we call that the most established key publication, which refer to the prominent publisher. For example, you can look at this Taylor and Francis, which is a very high quality peer-reviewed journal articles. You can look for systematic review, as well as you can refer to the meta-analysis. And this, we call that three important elements will help you to identify a research gap with regard to your field or topic of study. You can browse, search in database, browse the outstanding established journal. For example, you can look at this RSI, Scopus, as well as we call that World of Science. So these are the outstanding journals that will help us to identify research gap, will help us to identify research problem or issue that is currently debated by the researcher. And you can also go for mind mapping. You in terms of you map the issue, or you map the we call area of interest, and with this mind mapping will direct it to identifying what are the research gap of particular topic or particular interest at present. And another way is that you can go to Google Trend, and with this searching in Google Trend, it will help us to identify what we call research question or research gap with regard to our topic. And also you can refer to specific research question where you can find it in thesis or research question that been published in, we call that, article journal, and try to question this research question, and from this we call that challenge question back the research question will directed to identifying a research gap for your particular we call the interest of topics. So this is one model. This is one model how to identify research gap by Kumar 2020. How to identify gap is by looking at a limitation of the past finding, whereby we will review literature. By reviewing literature, we'll be able us to identify the past knowledge, and we'll be able to identify what is the existing knowledge. And from this reviewing of literature, identifying or what are the weaknesses of the past study, it will create what we call research opportunity in terms of what expected knowledge or what is required knowledge or what is unknown. And that particular, we call the unknown, unidentified is considered something that we refer to a research gap. And further explanation or further argument by Kumar on how to identify research gap is that try to look the area of overlap between known and unknown, and try to look at these 4 criteria: inconsistency, controversy, conflict, and contradict. With these 4 elements, it was directed to formulating a research gap in terms of gap in population, gap in concept, as well as other gaps. So the last one, some of the gap that been identified through literature review. So for example, over here, evidence gap, we refer to contradictory evidence gap, something that relates to a result of study allowed for conclusion on their own right only, but are contradictory when examined for more aspect from point of view. Knowledge gap, that is knowledge what gap, refer to desired research finding that do not exist, and this will create something that can enhance to the body of knowledge. Practical knowledge gap or action knowledge complete gap, we refer to a professional behavior or practices which is different or deviates from the research finding or not covered by current research. And this is another way of identifying, we call that the real practice out there, by looking at this practical knowledge gap. Methodological gap or method and research design gap. And this is, we refer to a variation of research method which is necessary to generate new insight or to avoid distorted of finding. So there are some methodology that can be used to further explain certain phenomena, and this particular methodology will uncover a new thing to contribute to the body of knowledge. Next will be empirical gap, that is evaluation of what gap. We refer to research finding or proposition need to be further evaluated, or the particular empirical finding need to be further verified by the current researcher. So another type of gap that can be identified through the literature is a theoretical gap, theory application what gap. So theory should be applied to certain research issue to generate insight. So sometimes there is a lack of theory, and this will create a gap. So what mean over here is that we should integrate a few theory in order for us to explain certain phenomena, and by integrating a few theory, this will create what we call gap in terms of theoretical gaps. So The last one would be population gap. Some of the research that been conducted by previous researcher, maybe they are focused on certain population only, and there exists we call it a vacuum over here in terms of doing research on other kind of gap, for example, something that we refer to new population gap in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. And this is one of the example of finding a gap in terms of to develop a new framework, whereby in this we call that write up, the researcher argue, comment, critiques, and the last one he come up with a particular gap, which is highlighting that the area of this research is remain neglected, and those created presenting a major gap in developing a general framework for understanding the area of international entrepreneurship. I think that's it from me in terms of how to identify a research gap, which is one of the important element in thesis writing as well as in articles publishing writing. That's from me. Thank you. Any question from the floor, please? Any question, please? Which part of the presentation or which part of the discussion that need to be further explained by me? I think if no further question, I stop my discussion and back to Madam Chairman for next presentation. Thank you very much.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
Sir, suppose a study is being done on a particular set of population. If I want to do the same study or similar study on a different set of population, would that be a research gap or not?
Come again.
Sir, suppose there's a particular research being done on a particular set of people. If I want to do a similar research on some other group of people, would that be a research gap?
So you need to create a research gap by go in depth of that particular, we call that research context. So for example, particular study it been done in a developed country, and we replicate it to be done in our country, developing country, but we need to further refine that particular population by looking at a specific or by looking at a focus area. For example, we're looking at one segment customer only, and this something that refer to creating a new gap of study. Meaning that we cannot simply duplicate, but we need to further refine, or we need to further explore. We call that the niche of this population, and this is something that we consider a gap in our study. So we cannot replicate, but we need to innovate to find what are the new area, especially in terms of context of study, that we contribute, we call that to the novelty of our research, that we contribute to the body of knowledge. So did that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
To the committee. Thank you very much.